Subcommittee will come to order, and let me begin first by expressing my apologies for being late in convening the hearing. There's been a number of crises today. One of them is the Ghananese. As you know, this committee is Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and they've had serious floods. So we've been working with the ambassador from Ghana to try to ensure that sufficient funding for those victims is provided. So I pushed back the schedule a bit, so I express my apologies to our witnesses as well as to our friends in the audience. I am truly sorry. Let me begin with some opening comments, and Karen Bass is on her way, as well as some of the other members of the subcommittee. I'd like to begin by recognizing the distinguished Vietnamese American leaders who are visiting Washington to discuss with members of Congress issues of concern to the community, including issues of freedom and human rights in Vietnam. Our former colleague, Ayn Cao, is here. Ayn was the first Vietnamese American to be elected to Congress, did yeoman's work in boat people, as Dr. Tong knows so well. I met him many, many years ago, a very distinguished members of Congress. There was no greater advocate for the people of Vietnam, past, present, or I would say respectfully into the future, but certainly past and present than Ayn was. He was tenacious on human rights in general, but when it came to Vietnam, no one cared more and did more on this side of the aisle, you know, as opposed to our witnesses. So I want to thank him for that leadership. Also, Joseph Reese, Ambassador Reese, who used to be Chief of Staff and has served in a number of capacities at the U.S. Department of State. Ambassador Reese, as I think many of you know, was our first ambassador to East Timor when that nation became an independent nation. And frankly, it was Joseph working with Dr. Tong in the mid-1990s when the boat people were being denied access to the United States and were housed, is probably the euphemism for the way they were being treated. They were incarcerated throughout all of Asia, including in prison in Hong Kong, and were being forced to be repatriated. It was Joseph, especially as the former chief counsel for the INS, who helped lead the way, along with Dr. Tong. We had 4 important pivotal hearings about the comprehensive plan of action put forward by the Clinton administration to forcibly repatriate Vietnamese to Vietnam, many of whom would go to re-education camps and to prison. And as a result of that, I offered an amendment on the floor from what we gleaned from all of that information, and we put a stop at turning it to that terrible forcible repatriation. And the Rover program then came into existence, and something on the order of 20,000 Vietnamese made their way to the United States because of that. And if it wasn't for Dr. Tong and Ambassador Reese, that would not have happened. So I want to recognize them and thank them for that extraordinary leadership. The Vietnamese American community is celebrating its 40th year in the United States, those who came after the fall of Saigon. And of course, we all remember the helicopters and the last few who made it. My own in-laws, my son is married to a Vietnamese American young lady who's about to have her second child. They left during the 1975 exodus. They were the lucky ones who were not part of the boat people exodus. And I just want to say how much all of us in Congress, both sides of the aisle, so deeply respect the contributions that have been made by the Vietnamese Americans to this country. Very, very strong patriots, men and women who are hardworking and have really made their mark on this country and have cared so deeply for their families and for their relatives and, of course, for all other Americans. Thank you for that. It is very, very important. This subcommittee has held numerous hearings on human rights in Vietnam over the years, and we have discussed a range of concerns, from restrictions on religious freedom to the jailing and torture of dissidents, from sex and labor trafficking to the censorship of the press and the internet. The Vietnamese government and Communist Party continue to be one of the worst abusers of human rights. We may want to sweep that reality under the table, and many do, sadly. We may want to paper it over by promises of security cooperation and trade deals. But that reality stares us in the face and requires us to ask whether U.S. policy really serves the people of Vietnam, people who want our liberties and our freedoms as much as our trade. The U.S. government must continue to press the Vietnamese government on truly fundamental human rights issues, not only in human rights dialogues, which very often are dead-end streets, but maybe they ought to be done, but in all meetings with Vietnamese officials, especially the trade meetings, and that means at the highest levels from the United States president on down. It can't be a sidebar issue. It can't be something that's in the appendix that's brought up in a cursory way so the president can say, oh, I raised human rights issues. He needs to raise it, especially with the upcoming visit, with specificity. Talk about individuals who are being incarcerated for their faith or because of their democracy activism and say, we want these people released. The president needs to do that, and he needs to do it when he meets with the head of state coming very shortly from Vietnam. 66% of the Vietnamese population is under 35, and some don't even remember the war except from history and from newsreels. They want their lives to look like those of their Vietnamese cousins in the U.S., in Australia, as well as in Canada. Our policies cannot be directed at the Vietnamese elite in the Communist Party, but must focus on the people of Vietnam. What is in their best interest, not the ruling clique who suppress. They understand that if the U.S. sides with the U.S. government, with the Vietnamese government, they will only receive crumbs from the Communist Party's table. Our economic security, freedom, and interests must be linked. The Vietnamese government needs U.S. security cooperation and economic benefits more than the U.S. needs Vietnam. We have leverage to bring about concrete changes in Vietnam, and we must not give up or ignore or trivialize or belittle that or squander that leverage. If human rights issues are not explicitly linked to our economic and security interests, we risk having discussions on trade and defense moving forward while human rights conditions go in the opposite direction and go backwards. Trade between the U.S. and Vietnam has exponentially expanded since Vietnam was granted normal trade relations in 2000. If this expansion is to continue under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I would say, for full disclosure, voted against the fast-tracking, believing that human rights have to be a centerpiece. And I have gone to the so-called secret room, and I read the key chapters. Don't count on human rights being enforced, including labor rights, if the TPP goes into effect as currently written. It is nice language, but no enforcement power contained in that document called the TPP. Let me point out to my colleagues that when the State Department removed Vietnam from the list of countries of particular concern as a gesture of goodwill, which I opposed in 2006, we once again saw backsliding. Promises were made. Ambassador Hanford, the ambassador on religious freedom, told me and so many others that there were deliverables that the Vietnamese government was committed to doing. None of them happened. Matter of fact, as soon as they got into the WTO, once we lifted our objection, there was a snapback, and many of the people that I had met on one of my many trips there were all rearrested and put back in incarceration. According to the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom annual report, and I quote, in pertinent part, the Vietnamese government continues to control all religious activities through law and administrative oversight, restrict independent practice, and represses individuals and religious groups it views as challenging its authority. I agree with the Commission's conclusion that Vietnam should be designated immediately a country of particular concern because of its egregious record of suppression and repression of human rights. In Vietnam, I have met courageous religious leaders during trips there, including Father Lee, the Venerable Thich Quang Do, and yet they remain wrongly detained today. There are disturbing reports that Father Lee is suffering poor health. There are over 150 prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. We should not forget them. We need to use our leverage to try to compel their release. Since some have made the case that Vietnam has made progress in recent years because they signed the UN Convention on Torture, I just want to say it's all about deeds. Anybody can sign a convention. Everybody can put on paper, oh, we're going to do this. We want deeds, and the deeds are not there. Let me also make a point that on trafficking, there is no doubt, and I'm the author, and again, Ambassador Reese will remember so well because he works so effectively on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. If there's ever a country that meets the definition of a Tier 3 country, an egregious violator, significant problem, and not taking significant actions to meet minimum standards prescribed by the TPVA of 2000 and its follow-on authorizations, Vietnam is it, both from the labor trafficking point of view as well as from the sex trafficking point of view, and Dr. Tong has testified to that many times in the past. I've reintroduced the Vietnam Human Rights Act. It's passed the Congress, the House that is, 3 separate Congresses. We're hoping to have it pass again. Maybe the 4th time will be the charm, and the Senate will take up the bill, and President Obama, who right now is against it, will reverse that and support the legislation. I would like to yield to my good friend and colleague any comments he might have for the gentleman from California, and then we'll go to our witnesses.